Our presentation today is by Judge Gonring of West Bend. He was going to talk on the history of Washington County and that. So make sure your ears are open and your mouth is closed and we can have a good time today. But remember, we will have time for questions afterwards and that. So thank you very much.
Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be back here today to talk to you about the early days of Washington County. Just by a show of hands, how many people were here in August when I talked about the founding of West Bend? Okay, we've got several. I'm going to apologize to you people up front because some of what I'm going to say today I said in August, and you're going to rehear it once again. And the reason I say that is when I give these talks, I like to put the topic in a historical perspective about what was going on in our nation and our state at that particular time. And when we talk about the founding of West Bend and we talk about the early days of Washington County, we're necessarily talking about the same historical perspective. So I apologize if you've heard some of this before. On the other hand, if your memory is anything like mine, you've probably forgotten everything I said in August. Anyway, I'd like to start these talks off with a couple of disclaimers. The first disclaimer relates to the subject matter of this talk. Again, this is not a talk about the history of Washington County as such. It's really a talk about the formation of Washington County, how the Washington County that we know today came about, and it's a general overview. Please remember, we're talking about a general overview of that topic. And that's number two. And number three is people tell me that when I give these talks, I use the word now quite a bit, so I apologize in advance for using the word now. Now, to put this topic in historical perspective, that is the early days of Washington County, we need to go back to the end of the Revolutionary War. At the time of the Revolutionary War, the vast majority of Americans were residing along the eastern seaboard between the Atlantic Ocean and what's called the Appalachian Divide, that group of mountain ranges that runs from Maine down to Georgia. It includes the White Mountains, the Green Mountains, the Smoky Mountains, etc. Very few people were living west of the Appalachian Divide in what was then called the wilderness or the frontier. But that changed with the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783, and people began to move in great numbers across the Appalachian Divide into the wilderness, to the point that within a few years after the Revolutionary War, there was an estimated 220,000 Americans residing in the wilderness, and that created certain practical problems for our young federal government. Problems like, how do we keep these people safe? How do we provide a system of commerce for any crops they grow or goods they produce? And how do we provide a system of laws that all settlers, no matter where they might be located, could rely on? And those practical problems were complicated by the fact that our United States Constitution, with the strong federal government that we're all familiar with today, was some years away from ratification. And in fact, there was a big dispute about whether that Constitution should be ratified at all. That is, do we want that kind of federal government, or should this young country be kind of a loose conglomeration of 13 individual sovereign states free to do what they wanted when they wanted it, with the role of the federal government simply being to act as referee in the event there is a dispute between two neighboring independent sovereign states. While that debate went on, many of the states, 13 original states, were acting as independent sovereigns. And they were claiming land in the wilderness wherever they found it, and they were claiming that land as a colony of that particular state, just like America had been a colony of Great Britain. So much so that what we now call Wisconsin at one point in time was claimed by three separate states, that being Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Virginia. Because the Continental Congress, as it was then called, did not have the benefit of the Constitution to deal with all these problems, they had to act on sort of a piecemeal basis under something called the Articles of Confederation. Because Articles of Confederation did not give them the power to deal with these issues wholesale, so they had to deal with them topic by topic through a series of laws called ordinances. And those ordinances culminated in what was known as the Ordinance of 1787, otherwise called the Northwest Ordinance. And some historians say that the Northwest Ordinance was the single most important document of its day, next to the Declaration of Independence. And what the Northwest Ordinance did is take a big piece of that wilderness everything west of the Mississippi River, east of the Appalachian Divide, north of the Ohio River, and south of Canada, and it called that the Northwest Territory, and it imposed certain rules and regulations on the Northwest Territory. For example, it outlawed slavery throughout the Northwest Territory. But the big thing that the Northwest Ordinance did is to say to the 13 original states, look, we don't care what you claim you own in the Northwest Territory. We're telling you you own nothing. All this land is owned by the federal government. We will determine what will happen to it. And in fact, we anticipate there will be at least 5 and perhaps as many as 7 new states that come in to the Union from the Northwest Territory. And when they come in, they're going to come in as states separate from and equal to the original 13. And that was a game changer. And the Northwest Ordinance also set forth how that would happen, which was basically to say that when Congress thought the time was right, they would carve out a piece of the Northwest Territory, create a separate independent territory. The President of the United States would appoint a territorial governor. The territorial governor would arrange for the election of a territorial legislature, and they would work together to get that territory ready for statehood, which would occur when the population of that independent territory reached 60,000 people. So in 1800, Congress carves out the Ohio Territory, which in 1803 becomes the state of Ohio. They do the same thing with the Indiana Territory in 1809 and the Illinois Territory in 1819, until what is left of the Northwest Territory is that part comprised of the present-day states of Michigan and Wisconsin, and then called the Michigan Territory. And it stays the Michigan Territory until July 3rd, 1836, when Congress carves out the western portion of the Michigan Territory and creates a separate independent territory called the Wisconsin Territory. Wisconsin meaning, my favorite definition is land of wild rushing water. I like that one. All right. Now, by way of full disclosure, when Wisconsin is made a separate independent territory, it includes more territory than the present state of Wisconsin. It actually included land west of the Mississippi River. But it would take too long to explain how that happened and why that happened, and it didn't stay that way long. So when I talk about the Wisconsin Territory, I'm talking about the same geographical boundaries as our present-day state of Wisconsin, okay? So now we have an independent territory called the Wisconsin Territory. We need a territorial governor. President Andrew Jackson appoints one of his fellow Indian fighters, Colonel Henry Dodge, as governor of the Wisconsin Territory. And Governor Dodge does 2 things immediately. One, he orders a census of the Wisconsin Territory to see how close we are to that magic 60,000 figure needed for statehood. That comes back some years later showing we got a ways to go. The census was 18,149. But he also arranges for the election of a territorial legislature, 13 members of what's called the Assembly, 26 members of what's called the House of Representatives, and on October 25th, 1836, the territorial legislature convenes for the very first time to start the business of governing the new Wisconsin Territory and getting that territory ready for statehood. And where do they meet for purposes of starting that process? In tiny Belmont, Wisconsin, in the far southwest corner of the territory, 17 miles southwest of what is now Mineral Point. And why the southwest corner of the Wisconsin Territory? Because that's where things are happening. The southwest corner of the territory of Wisconsin is the headquarters of the lead mining industry, and it is lead mining that is bringing more settlers into the territory of Wisconsin than any other industry, including fur trapping, which had been the #1 industry. All right? Lead mining is so important to our Wisconsin history that the image of those lead miners living in caves in the sides of the hills in southwestern Wisconsin gives rise to our state mascot, the badger. And if you look at the official seal of the state of Wisconsin, as shown on the state flag of Wisconsin, for example, you see 2 people standing there. One is a Great Lakes sailor, and the other is a lead miner. Now, when the territorial legislature gets to Belmont in October of 1836, they obviously have a lot on their plate. One of the issues is, where is the capital of our hopefully soon new state of Wisconsin going to be? That's an interesting talk that we don't have time for. The other issue is the issue of roads, and if you were here in August, we talked a lot about roads because roads were critical to the expansion of the Wisconsin Territory back in 1836. Because if you are anticipating and hoping for 60,000 settlers to come into the territory so you qualify for statehood, you need a system of roads to let them move around in order to establish homesteads and build settlements. And in 1836, the Wisconsin Territory is really nothing but a vast wilderness. Roads are few and far between, the primary means of transportation being Indian trails and waterways, rivers, lakes, and streams. Back in August, we talked a lot about the three types of roads. The first being what was called a military road, and that was a road constructed by the United States military for purposes of getting federal troops from point A to point B. And in 1836, Wisconsin had one military road called the Military Road, which connected Fort Howard with Fort Winnebago with Fort Crawford, which today we call Green Bay, Portage, and Prairie du Chien. We also talked about federal roads. And federal roads, although not many, were those roads built by the federal government, usually straight shots of limited duration and built by the federal government to assist commerce, many of them connecting two waterways, for example. But we also talked about territorial roads. And territorial roads are the most important of the three types of roads that existed in 1836, because territorial roads were the roads authorized and paid for by the territorial government for the express purpose of opening up this vast wilderness to allow settlers to move freely through the wilderness to establish homesteads and hopefully build settlements. Territorial roads are so important to the history of the state of Wisconsin that between July 3rd, 1836, when Wisconsin became an independent territory, and May 29th, 1848, when Wisconsin became a state, the territorial legislature authorized and built 220 territorial roads throughout Wisconsin. Right? But there is a third issue on the plate of the legislators in Belmont in October of 1836, and that is, how are we going to administer this vast wilderness? The state of Wisconsin today, as did the Wisconsin Territory as I've defined it, consisted of 65,498 square miles. That's a lot of territory. And the legislature is anticipating this influx of settlers so they can get to that magic $60,000 figure, especially once they start building these territorial roads. And they realize the need to have smaller governmental units where these settlers could go and, for example, file paperwork related to land purchases, settle legal disputes, and also have a framework for the election of local officials who could deal with local issues. And the way you accomplish all that is through a system of counties. Now, even when Wisconsin was part of the Michigan Territory, it was divided into counties, albeit not many. Originally, Wisconsin was divided into two counties. There was a line drawn north to south, with the western half of Wisconsin called Crawford County, and the eastern half of Wisconsin called Brown County. Then, as these population centers began to develop, the Michigan Territory decided that it would be in the best interest of those settlers to carve out a separate territory to assist them governmentally. The first population pocket, obviously, being the southwest corner of the territory due to the lead mining industry. So in January of 1830, the Michigan Territory takes that big Crawford County and carves out about the bottom fifth and creates a separate independent county that they call Iowa County. Then as more settlers began to arrive into the territory by way of Lake Michigan and settle in the southeast corner of the state or the territory and immediately inland, the Michigan Territory decides to take about the bottom fourth of what was Brown County, carve that out and create a separate independent county which they call Milwaukee County. So that when the legislature arrives in Belmont in October of 1836, the Wisconsin Territory already consists of 4 counties, but the legislature is convinced that that's not going to be enough. We need more subdivisions of government to assist these settlers that we assume are going to be coming in great numbers into our new Wisconsin Territory. So one of the very first things they do when they arrive at Belmont in October of 1836 is take those original 4 counties and further divide them into an additional 15 counties for a total of 19 counties. And they do that in the first 2 months of arriving at Belmont. The majority of those counties are like in the bottom third of what we today call Wisconsin, and they're familiar to all of us. The 15 new counties were Walworth, Racine, Jefferson, Dane, Portage, Dodge, Sheboygan, Fond du Lac, Calumet, Manitowoc, Marquette, Grant, Greene, Rock, and effective December 7th, 1836, Washington County. Now, even though overnight we've gone from 4 counties to 19 counties, that 19 county system is far different than our present 72 county system in 2 important respects. Number one is that although these new counties have been officially made by the legislature, they did not necessarily govern themselves. The majority of these new counties, if not all of them, were governed by one of the pre-existing counties, and would be until the legislature decides that that county is mature enough to allow itself to govern its own people. That's number one. Number two is, although the legislature defines these specific 15 new counties, that doesn't mean they kept that shape. The legislature over the years took some of those counties and further subdivided them into additional counties, and both those points are true of the original Washington County built, or rather declared on December 7th, 1836. First of all, Washington County did not govern itself. It was originally governed out of Milwaukee County. And it was governed out of Milwaukee County until 1840, 4 years after its creation, when the state legislature passes something called the Law of Organization and determines that Washington County should now be self-governing. And then it was even, at that point in time, it was just for civil purposes. The court system was still run out of Milwaukee County for another 5 years until 1845. That's point number one. Point number two is the original Washington County, as created by the territorial legislature on December 7th, 1836, was, as I like to call it, supersized. Its north and south boundaries ran from our neighboring Dodge County in the west due east all the way to the shores of Lake Michigan, and included what we today call Ozaukee County. And that decision of the territorial legislature to create a supersized Washington County gave rise to years and years of political intrigue, infighting, backstabbing, jealousy, and outright fraud. And that's what we're going to discuss for the rest of this talk. That political intrigue, infighting, backstabbing, etc., was all geographically based. It was east versus west. And so we need to talk a little bit about what Washington County looked like in those early days. Washington County, when it was formed in December of 1836, was much like the Wisconsin Territory itself. It was a vast wilderness, especially in the western part of the county. If you were here in August, you remember we talked about the fact that it wasn't until 1845, 9 years after Washington County became an independent county itself, that the territorial legislature decided to open up the western portion of Washington County by building one of these territorial roads that we talked about. This particular territorial road was meant to connect the soon-to-be incorporated city of Milwaukee with what would be in the next few years the second largest city in Wisconsin, that being Fond du Lac. And if you recall our discussion from August, the key to building one of these territorial roads was the appointment of a territorial land commission, the guys that would actually go out and lay out the road, mark the trail, so to speak. And in the case of the Milwaukee to Fond du Lac Territorial Road, there were 3 members of the commission, Byron Kilbourne, James Nealon, and E.B. Walcott, none of whom were road builders or frontiersmen, but all of whom rather were businessmen and land speculators. And I suspect all 3 had to grease the palms of some certain local politicians in order to get appointed onto that commission, because these are pretty sweet jobs. If you're the one laying out the new road, you're the one automatically determining what land is more valuable than other land as it relates to the location of that new road, right? And because you're the first one to know that, you're the first one with the opportunity to purchase that land from the territorial government. So I am sure that when these 3 guys set forth from Milwaukee on horseback, accompanied by a surveyor by the name of Jasper Vliet, as in Vliet Street in Milwaukee, I am sure that they had in the back of their mind the idea that somewhere along the line they would find land suitable for settlement that they could buy, which would be good for the settlers using the new road and good for the commissioners themselves. And that's exactly what happens when they get halfway between Milwaukee and Fond du Lac and find land suitable for settlement along a bend of the Milwaukee River in an area described as an unbroken wilderness of heavily forested hardwood trees. So after they're done laying out the new road, they return to Milwaukee, they go to the Territorial Land Office and buy 720 acres of land in what is now the city of West Bend for the grand price of $900 or $1.25 per acre. They get Mr. Vliet to lay out a plat of the settlement that will occur on part of that 720 acres. He does that, he designs that, and on January 3rd, 1846, they file with the appropriate territorial authorities the original plat of West Bend. They build a sawmill, they build a grist mill, and in the late 1840s, West Bend begins to take off. At the same time, 20 miles to the southwest, the Rossman brothers are doing the same thing. The Rossman brothers find land on the Rubicon River, which would make a good site for a sawmill and a grist mill. They build those improvements, and a community takes off 20 miles southwest of here that we today call Hartford. All right? So, in the western part of the state, we've got West Bend, we've got Hartford, we've got various individual settlers here and there, but not until the late 1840s. That's not the case with regards to the eastern part of the supersized Washington County, because even in the 1830s, we already had settlements in the eastern part of the supersized Washington County. Because just like America at the time of the Revolutionary War, the vast majority of people coming to what would be the Wisconsin Territory resided along the shore of Lake Michigan or immediately inward. So in the 1830s, we had settlements in what was called Wisconsin City, later to be called Port Washington, in Hamburg, which was later to be called Grafton, and in Mequon. So it's not a surprise that when Wisconsin creates this Washington County in December of 1836, that they appoint Port Washington as the seat of justice or the county seat. Right? Then things start to get interesting. The first thing that happens is Port Washington goes into this period of steep decline. As best as I can understand it, Port Washington was owned primarily by land speculators. And to move to Port Washington took a lot of money, and to live in Port Washington took a lot of money. And although they were able to induce certain people to settle in Port Washington, it never really took off. Then our country had something called the Panic of 1837, which was basically a depression, and that affected these land speculators and their holdings in Port Washington. And it got to the point where even the few settlers in Port Washington said, enough's enough, we're out of here. They leave and there's nothing in Port Washington, right? But that has ramifications to the new Washington County because Port Washington is supposed to be the county seat. So the leaders of the then Washington County decide to unofficially move the county seat from Port Washington to Hamburg, i.e. Grafton. But in reality, the affairs of Washington County are being run out of the private residence of a guy down in Mequon, a guy by the name of William T. Bonnywell, as in Bonnywell Road, if any of you are familiar with that. Mr. Bonnywell owns a farm in southern Washington County on what we today call Wauwatosa Road, and his house is basically the center of Washington County. That's where the business is being transacted, and the people of Washington County are not happy about that. They raise a big stink about whether or not anything the county has done at that point in time is justifiable. Is the county seat supposed to be Hartford, or excuse me, it's supposed to be Port Washington, and you're running it out of Mr. Bonnywell's house? There's all kinds of disputes. It takes an act of the legislature to kind of clean up that whole mess, but people are not happy about what's happening in Washington County. That whole thing comes to kind of a peak when in 1846, 2 years before Wisconsin becomes a state, the territorial legislature says to the various counties, we are about to become a state, so we're changing things up. First of all, we're changing the form of county government. It had been a 3-person commission. They say now we're going to change it to a board of supervisors, much like we have today. The second thing they say is, if you have not yet divided your county into township subdivisions, you need to do that now, because that county board is going to be made up of one representative from each township. If you're not familiar with townships, townships are 6 mile by 6 mile square subdivisions of a county, composed of 36 individual what we call sections, mile by mile square pieces. 36 of those in the 6 mile by 6 mile square section. So for example, the town of Polk is 6 miles by 6 miles, for example. All right, not a problem in Washington County. But then the territorial legislature says, and because we are so close to statehood, now is the time for each county by election of eligible voters being male white adults, by eligible voters to select the municipality you want to be the temporary official county seat. But the winner of that election needs to get 50% of the vote. So, in April of 1846, we have an election for the temporary official county seat of the supersized Washington County. Now, before we get to the results of that, we need to talk about one other thing, and that's the concept of the county farm. Back in the day before welfare, for example, it was not uncommon for counties to take a piece of real estate and set it aside for indigent people to grow the food they needed to live on. That was called the county farm, sometimes called the poor farm. That concept in later years gave rise to the county home, and I'm sure many of you remember that spooky old building that we had in West Bend at the corner of Indiana and Washington Street that for many years we called the county home. And I can remember as a kid the farm fields and huge gardens behind the county home, and additionally, I can recall certain farm animals being located back there as well. But in the early years of Washington County had a county farm. That county farm was located in Township 10 North, Range 18 East, or Range 20 East of Washington County, which is the official designation of the town of Jackson. All right. Section 3 of the town of Jackson, the 6 mile by 6 mile square, is located on the far north edge of Washington County and would today abut what we call Highway NN, about a mile west of the intersection of NN and Highway M, if you can envision that. That's where the county farm was. And if you look at a map of the supersized Washington County, and they have one upstairs, you'll see that Section 3 of the town of Jackson is about smack dab in the middle of the supersized Washington County. So we have this vote. In April of 1836, only 3 months after the official plat of the settlement of West Bend is filed, and here are the results. 861 votes are cast. The county farm gets 371 votes. The northeast quarter of Section 3 of Township 10 North, Range 20 West, the legal description of county farm, gets 88 votes. Port Washington gets 164 votes. It's made its comeback. The relatively new Cedarburg gets 100 votes. Hamburg, i.e. Grafton, gets 74 votes. The center of the county gets 32 votes. A good location near the center of the county gets 70 votes. And although it's only 3 months old, the settlement of West Bend gets 12 votes. Now, the election officials throw out the county farm because there's nothing there. There's no municipality there. It's a farm field. They also throw out the indefinite center of the county and a good place near the center of the county. So it comes down to Port Washington, Cedarburg, Grafton, and this new place called West Bend. Port Washington is clearly the winner. They have a plurality of the votes, but they do not have 50% of the votes. So we have no official temporary county seat. But that vote is a good foreshadowing of what is to come in the history of Washington County, especially as it relates to the East versus West, and Port Washington's identification of this upcoming West Bend as its arch enemy. All right? Now, I've said nothing about Hartford in this, and the reason for that is Hartford really wanted nothing to do with this whole thing. Hartford was convinced that at some point in time the territorial legislature was going to take the western part of Washington County and the eastern part of Dodge County and create a brand new county, and because they're smack dab in the middle of that, they would be the county seat. So their initial reaction was, you guys go ahead and do what you want. We're going to take our chances that we're going to be the county seat of this new county once it is in fact declared by the territorial legislature. But the fact that we have no temporary official county seat gets us back to that mess where we have no place to hold meetings other than people's private homes. Many of the county functions are being held in a guy's tavern, a guy named George Irish. He's holding county stuff in his tavern, and the people of Washington County are getting more and more frustrated. 2 years of that uncertainty goes by. Then we get to May 29th, 1848. Wisconsin officially becomes a state, and the state legislature then says to the various counties, now that we are a state, you need to have a vote for an official county seat. Now, in most counties, that would not be a problem, right? For 2 years, they've had a temporary county seat. This is just kind of an act to declare that temporary county seat the official county seat, but that's not the case in Washington County. What it means in Washington County is 3 elections over the course of the next 5 months, and although the field of potential county seat candidates is reduced for each election, nobody gets 50% of the vote. And the allegations of fraud, ballot box stuffing, misconduct by election officials, etc., would make our 2020 presidential election look like a cakewalk. So the first vote is held in August of 1848. There are 2,036 votes cast. 8 municipalities get votes, and including, when I say municipalities, I include the county farm, because this farm field is still getting votes. The county farm, Saukville, Newburgh, and Newark, which would later have its name changed to Barton, all get votes. But of the big 3, Port Washington comes in first, Cedarburg comes in second, and West Bend comes in third. But its vote total has grown from 12 2 years earlier when we had the temporary vote to 336. That certainly raises eyebrows and raises suspicion by people in Port Washington as to how that vote went up as much as it did in the course of 2 years. But since nobody got 50% of the vote, we have a second election. That's in November of 1848. And this time the powers that be say, we're limiting the field of candidates. We're limiting it to the big 3, the 3 that got the most votes, Port Washington, Cedarburg, and West Bend. Now, because of the location of Cedarburg and Port Washington, their votes kind of cancel each other. They're kind of split. And lo and behold, who gets the largest plurality? This relatively new village of West Bend. The interesting thing is that election includes 600 more votes than the one just 3 months previously. And West Bend's total goes from 336 to 1,117 in just 3 months. So you can imagine the cries of fraud coming from the east side of the county. But again, nobody got 50% of the vote. So in January of 1849, 2 months later, we have a third vote. This time the legislature says, okay, we're limiting it to the top 2 finishers. You vote for West Bend or you vote for Cedarburg. And Port Washington is madder than heck. They're not in the picture, and their goal all along has been to be the county seat. So the votes are cast, they're totaled up, and lo and behold, there are 986 votes, write-in votes for a third candidate. That third candidate being neither. And you can imagine where those neither votes came from. They came from Port Washington and their allies. But as a result of those neither votes, nobody gets 50% of the vote, which makes Port Washington very happy, but which frustrates the people of West Bend and starts frustrating the state legislature as well. Then things take an interesting turn. People are really mad. We have no courthouse. We have no official meeting place. We have no place to hold official records. They are inundating the legislature with requests to do something. Finally, a delegation goes to the state legislature and says, just name a county seat. And the legislature, being the legislature, says, we have a better idea. we are going to split Washington County into 2 separate counties, but not east and west, rather north and south, with the North County to be called Washington County and the South County to be called Tuscola County. Nobody likes this idea. But Port Washington and Cedarburg particularly don't like it. Port Washington doesn't like it because they aren't the outright winner in this thing. And we have a vote on the issue of whether we should approve that plan, but we need to digress a little bit and talk about the demographics of Washington County at that time, because I find this very interesting. The northern part of Washington County, particularly in the east, had pockets of population where the Catholics, Irish Catholics and Luxembourg Catholics, were in the majority and the German Lutherans were in the minority. Just the opposite occurred in the southern part of the county around Freistadt and Kirkine, where you've got German Lutherans in the majority and you've got Irish Catholics in the minority. Port Washington and Cedarburg take advantage of that before this north-south election, and they send writers off to those populations in the north to warn the Lutheran minority that if this north-south split goes through, you will be ruled by the steeple, meaning the Catholic Church is going to tell you what to do. Then they send writers down to the southern part of the state and tell the Irish Catholics in the minority in those populations that if this north-south split goes through, your Irish Catholic kids are going to have to learn to speak German. Needless to say, that proposal goes down in defeat by almost a 6-to-1 margin. 275 votes in favor, 1,716 votes against. Now people are really frustrated, and the legislature is getting frustrated and a little bit embarrassed as well. So they try one last kick at the cat. They say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to officially place temporarily the county seat in Grafton. And we are telling you, you then have to have a vote to determine whether or not the county seat should be moved to West Bend within the next 5 years to give West Bend time to get ready to be the county seat. Of course, that does not fly in Port Washington and Cedarburg. And that vote, although it was fairly close, at least closer than the last vote, goes down to defeat by about 700 votes. 1789 for, 2496 against. But the interesting thing about that vote is Port Washington and Cedarburg are not allowed to vote because of the fact that they fooled around with the legislature's north-south vote the year before. But again, surprisingly, that loses. And again, there are cries of voter fraud, this time from West Bend towards the east. But this one has got some teeth, because after the fact, they do a poll, and little old Belgium, which is a Port Washington ally in the northeast portion of the supersized Washington County, has at the most 300 eligible voters, yet they cast 763 votes. All right. Now we're well into this mess and we still don't have a county seat. Finally, some common sense prevails, and there's an alliance formed in Madison. The Port Washington lobby in Madison sits down with the West Bend lobby in Madison and says, look, what if we took the supersized Washington County and split it in two? Not north and south like the legislature proposed, but rather east and west. We draw a north-south line down the middle of the county, and we, Port Washington, will be the county seat of the East County, and you, West Bend, can be the county seat of the West County. And West Bend says, yeah, we can live with that. And they go to the legislature, and the legislature basically says, you guys would both be happy with this? Yes, we'd both be happy with this. Done deal. They run legislation through the state legislature, and on March 4th, 1853, Chapter 21 of the laws of 1853 are passed, which divides the supersized Washington County along the line that we are familiar with Washington County in the west, Ozaukee County in the east, Port Washington, the county seat of Ozaukee County, West Bend, the county seat of Washington County, and we're done. Maybe, but not quite. Because someone, and I suspect it was someone associated with Cedarburg or Grafton, takes a look at the Wisconsin Constitution and notices that Article 13, Section 7 said then, as it still says today, that the legislature cannot divide a county in Wisconsin without a vote of approval by its residents if that county has less than 900 square miles. They do the math, and lo and behold, the supersized Washington County has less than 900 square miles. So they start a lawsuit. They challenge the constitutionality of the act by the legislature in creating Washington and Ozaukee County. That lawsuit ends up in the Supreme Court, and in the summer of 1853, the Wisconsin Supreme Court issues its decision in the state of Wisconsin, ex rel Simeon D. Powers versus Charles H. Larrabee. Charles H. Larrabee is the circuit court judge, that's why his name is in there. And that opinion is reported in volume 1, page 200 of the official reports of the state of Wisconsin. The official reports of the state of Wisconsin include every reported decision of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and in recent years, some of the reported decisions of the Court of Appeals. By my count, we now have over 650 volumes of official reports. This is volume 1. Volume 1, page 200. And in that decision, the Wisconsin Supreme Court says, yes, Article 13, Section 7 of the Wisconsin Constitution says that the legislature cannot divide a county of less than 900 acres without approval, 900 square miles, without the approval of the citizens of that county. Yes, there was no vote by the citizens of the county to divide Washington County into Washington and Ozaukee. And yes, the supersized Washington County had less than 900 square miles, if you look at the dry land. But remember, I talked about these townships, 6 mile by 6 mile squares. The eastern portion of the supersized Washington County included the town of Belgium, the town of Port Washington, the town of Grafton, and the town of Mequon. And the shore of Lake Michigan cut through about the middle of all 4 of those townships. And the Supreme Court in its decision says, we don't think we're bound by the dry land measurement. We think we can take into account the entire township, much of which is underwater in Lake Michigan. And if we include that part of those townships into the calculation of how big the supersized Washington County is, it's more than 900 square miles. And that's the way we are going to view it. And to this day, the boundaries of Ozaukee County extend into Lake Michigan to include those completed townships. But that puts an end, finally, to the litigation. 17 years after Washington County becomes a county, 13 years after Washington County becomes self-governing in 1840, 7 years after the original failed vote for a temporary county seat, we have finally resolved the issue of the mess of Washington County. I'm going to talk about 2 other little things because I find them interesting. Although we've resolved all this, there is still an interesting issue that has to do with the official county records, right? The supersized county had been Washington County, right? The records are Washington County records. So in the legislation creating Ozaukee County, the legislature says, these are Washington County records, we understand, but Ozaukee County has the right to copy those records. Unfortunately for Washington County, those records are in the possession of Ozaukee County. They are in Port Washington, and Port Washington and Ozaukee County have no intent to give up those records to its archenemy, Washington County, whatsoever. That results in 2 midnight raids by West Benders into Port Washington to attempt to retrieve those Washington County records. In the first midnight raid, the sheriff of Ozaukee County is tipped off, and the invaders sneak in under the dark of night ready to grab the records, and there's the sheriff and other town folk. They repel the invaders, and they're forced to retreat to West Bend. Then a guy who is sympathetic to the West Bend cause, the Washington County cause, who, if I recall, was an editor of a newspaper over in Port Washington, sends a letter to Leander Frisbee, who is a very noted lawyer here in West Bend, and says, I have some of the records, and I know where the rest of the records are. If you can get here under the cover of darkness, I will turn over those records and let you know where the other ones are. So in the middle of the night, a contingent of West Benders goes over, meets with the editor, obtains those records, grabs their other records, and return to West Bend in the early morning hours like conquering heroes. They have a cart full of official records, and everyone's happy. The other issue I want to talk about, however, has to do with the building of the courthouse. At least there was no dispute about where the new Washington County Courthouse should be built, because those guys who were the founders of West Bend that I talked about earlier and filed that plat of survey of the official plat of West Bend back in January of 1846, dedicated an entire city block to the community as either a park or a place for a county building. And that square block in the middle of that plat of survey was kitty corner right over here. And it was in that parkland where in 1889 our beautiful Romanesque revival style old courthouse was built and still stands today. Right? Now that beautiful courthouse replaced what had been the original courthouse for Washington County, which was a modest wood-framed building that stood on that square also. Once this beautiful new courthouse is built, that wood frame, simple structure, the original courthouse, is moved down to the corner of Hickory and Main, and for many years serves as a hardware store. And I've often thought it's a fitting and ironic end to this mess about what Washington County is, to have the original courthouse of West Bend in Washington County end up being a hardware store. So that's it for me. That should be about 45 minutes. If there are questions, I will be glad to hear the questions, but I don't guarantee any answers. So, any questions?
Much. So anybody have any questions? I and my friend over there are going to be here with the microphone so that we can hear your questions and that on both sides of the room. Questions?
Yes. Who chose the names like Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana? Who made those choices, and how did they come about?
That's an excellent question. I don't know the answer to that. The Wisconsin name, as I indicated, means different things to different people. As I said, I like the name Wild Rushing Water. There were, of course, early settlers that went through, Nicolet, etc. And I'm sure it was these early French explorers that came up with most of these names for the lands in the Northwest Territory. How they chose those names, though, I have no idea.
How about the name Ozaukee County? Do you have any history on Ozaukee?
Yeah, I've read two things about Ozaukee County. I've read one means land of yellow clay, and the other means people who live at the mouth of the river. Because if you're familiar with Port Washington, it's really kind of a U-shaped bluff with the Sauk River going through the middle of it. And the term Ozaukee, in one definition, refers to the Native Americans that lived at the mouth of the Sauk River in the middle of that bluff. But those are two completely different definitions. So I can't help you there. Yes?
How much did the St. Lawrence Seaway and Lake Michigan influence the settlement on the east side of Wisconsin, other than Milwaukee? Did that get people in, or was there not that much?
No, there were settlements. When I mentioned the original 15 additional counties, I mentioned, for example, Marquette County. Marquette County is up in that area, right? There are other counties I mentioned that are up in that area, and I'm sure that those were founded by people who arrived from Lake Michigan, through Lake Michigan to those upper areas. Byron Kilbourne, who I mentioned as one of the founders of West Bend, we talked about him at length when I was here in August. He was a surveyor originally, and he sails up to Green Bay and works his way down the eastern shore to Milwaukee, where he buys land in Milwaukee. But certainly people were going up in that area. That's why Fort Howard was there in Green Bay, because that was an area of settlement.
Andy, if Port Washington had a newspaper, did West Bend also have a newspaper at that time?
They had a newspaper, I don't know if it was in the 1840s, but they had a newspaper, and I can't think of the name of it. It was a German name. It begins with a B. You know it here. Yeah. Thank you. Say it again. Beobachter. That was the main newspaper in West Bend because West Bend was primarily a German area.
Were the names of the people that made the trip to Port Washington, were they ever known?
Yeah, you can. I don't know that I trust it, but
Did they
they're
become the city fathers?
not necessarily. I mean, what kind of people do you think are going to make a midnight raid into a neighboring county? They're not necessarily the type that are going to become city fathers, right? But I've read some things about their names that I can't recall. Anything else?
Can you explain why Washington County and Ozaki County have that JAG?
That JAG? Yeah. Okay, here's the best that I can tell about that. So I sat down with Brian Braithwaite, who is the county recorder up at the courthouse, and I asked him about that. And the way he explained it to me is the western line of Washington County and the eastern line of Washington County, the dividing line between Washington and Ozaki County, are both on what are called range lines. Range lines are used to make legal descriptions, all right? So you've got these range lines, that's why town of Jackson was Township 10 North, Range 20 East, or 20 West rather. I mean, that's how you define townships, that's how we get our legal descriptions. But because the earth is round, if we don't adjust those range lines every now and then, we'd end up with a real mess, right? So every once in a while, you've got to move those range lines, and it just so happens that the western side of Washington County was on one of those range lines, and when the legislature decided to divide the two counties, they divided it on another range line, and they just happened to make that adjustment in Washington County.
Andy, I'm curious if the original wood structure courthouse building that was moved to the hardware store is still in place in our town.
No, I think that's been gone for quite a while. It's kind of a shame. I mean, nowadays we probably would have done something, you know, to save that original Washington County courthouse, but it's been long gone. Anything else? If not, once again, it was a pleasure to come and talk to you. Thank you for being so attentive. Oh,
I have a question as to what was going on with the Indians in the state at that time. Were they moving them out? Were they doing reservations? What was going on?
yeah, it was not a good situation, obviously. There was something, I can't remember the name of the act, but there was a federal act, I think in 1832, that basically moved the Indians out, which allowed these land speculators to come in, for example, and claim Ozaki or Port Washington in what became Ozaki County, but which really had been an Indian settlement for many, many days. I can't remember the name of that act, but I believe it was in 1832. Okay,
Any
once
other
again,
questions?
thank you very much. Pleasure to be here again. Have a good day.